I'm Soren Bjornstad. Welcome to this tour of my Zettelkasten. The purpose of this tour is kind of twofold. One, I want to talk just some about the Zettelkasten system and that method of taking notes, why you would want to use it, how you can organize a Zettelkasten, and why you would want to organize it that way. And then second, talk about how we can implement that in TiddlyWiki. TiddlyWiki is kind of the focus of a lot of the educational resources I do, so that's why I'm doing this video primarily. But I think just having more resources on Zettelkasten is also a great thing. It's something that I was going to say I'm passionate about. I don't know if I would actually go quite that far, but I really like the Zettelkasten method. I think it's very valuable, at least if you're the type of person to be watching this video. If you have a lot of different ideas, you like figuring out how to integrate those, Zettelkasten might be for you. So the first thing to know about my Zettelkasten is that most of it is public on the web here at zettelkasten.sorenbjornstad.com. If you can't remember how to spell that, you can also go to 562.nz. That will just redirect you right out here. This doesn't have everything that's in my Zettelkasten, but it has a lot of it. There is some personal stuff that I like to be able to keep integrated with all of the public stuff, but not share it with the entire internet. So we'll talk a little bit about how I accomplish that in TiddlyWiki later. But for the time being, I'm going to switch over to the private one because there's some tools and stuff in there that we'll want to see during the course of this video that are not available in the public one. So I'll just try to keep away from anything that would not belong out on an instructional video on the internet. And I have run through this, so I'm pretty sure I will be able to do that. So I have an outline out here. I do intend to publish this. I don't think it's up there quite yet, and it will probably look a little bit different because I'm going to go through and clean up all of the links and make sure they're helpful if you want more information on the stuff in there. But we'll go through this outline during the tour. So first off, what generally is a Zettelkasten? I don't want to bore anybody who's already heard about it, and there's a whole lot that you can learn about it, so I'll just do a brief description. Essentially, the name means slip box in German, as in like a slip of paper, a box containing such slips of paper. It was invented, or at least the modern form was described by a sociologist named Niklas Luhmann, who wrote an insane number of books. I believe it was over 50. He posthumously published more books than most people published during their lifetime, and he claims a lot of it was due to this system. So the system is a means of putting ideas together when you don't necessarily know what the ideas will be useful for yet. So you create small cards or slips, or in TiddlyWiki we make them tiddlers, each containing a particular idea, broken down as finely as reasonably possible, and then you relate those ideas with other similar ideas. In the original implementation, this was done in a card file, although actually Luhmann used slips of paper rather than cards, just normal weight paper, just because the cards would have been too voluminous to be able to read all of them while sitting at one desk. Now with TiddlyWiki, we don't have to worry about the format limitations of paper, and so there are some differences in terms of how I relate ideas. In the original implementation, one of the common ways you would relate ideas to each other was simply by positioning them next to each other in the card file. In TiddlyWiki, whether something is physically close to or distant from is not really a consideration, so in the original Zettelkasten, there was both that proximity and an explicit link to another location. In the Zettelkasten, we just have a link. But otherwise, a great deal of the system is preserved. Most of the differences in my system have to do with format changes rather than with changes in the underlying principles of the system. So as I go through here, I hope you'll see some examples of that. Basically, most of the tiddlers in here are ideas. They describe one specific thing. Let me just even see if I can find a good example here. How about this one here? So here's a little explication. There's a couple paragraphs here. There are a lot of links to other ideas, which are the related topics. This actually has an unusually low number of related ideas, but I could hop into, say, dystopia. We would see some examples of possible dystopic scenarios, and we can move from there. And by walking down these links, we can find our way down many different trains of thought very quickly. So that kind of mimics the way that your brain operates by allowing you to go off in a lot of different directions. And you don't have to know what the structure is going to be before you do it. Most traditional note-taking methods kind of require you to categorize things into particular topics. Or, if you try to outline something, outlining is nice often, but it does kind of force a more linear organization. Whereas with this, you can go off in so many different directions. I think one great demonstration of this is the link graph view that I have here, right? So this shows what I've linked to out several levels, and you can see obviously that it explodes into many different directions. So most people who use a system like this find that the Zettelkasten mimics your thought process much better than most other systems, and so it enables you to reproduce some of the creativity that you get from actually having stuff in your head while being able to put it down on paper, which has some significant advantages. Most obviously, you don't risk forgetting it. It will stay the way you put it. But also, taking the time to write out a description of the idea here often helps solidify it, helps you remember it even, and makes it just easy to think about it in a different way because you're putting it in a different form. So I would say that's basically the Zettelkasten. You'll see some more examples as we go along, certainly. I will say this is a work in progress. Obviously, the content of the Zettelkasten is always a work in progress, but my implementation of it in TiddlyWiki is also a work in progress. I'm sure I'll talk as we go along about some things that I expect will change in the future or that I have changed already. That's one of the really nice things about TiddlyWiki is that because the tooling can be customized in the same place and using even the same methods as you write your content, you can kind of evolve those together. So as your needs for the content change, the tool kind of comes along with you when you're experienced in TiddlyWiki. You will notice one obvious thing here is that my names of tiddlers are all in CamelCase, which is this there are no spaces between words, and each word starts with a new capital letter. So that is a kind of wiki thing that's less popular on modern wikis than it used to be. I find it very helpful. It makes it very easy to link to things because you can simply write out the word or the title of the tiddler in that format, and TiddlyWiki will know it's a title of a tiddler and link to it. But it also, I find it helps to encourage me to create a concise name for things, which serves as an easy way to remember it or think about it in the future. So oftentimes I will, be able to remember an idea, not know exactly where it is, but I will remember the title or at least a couple important words in it, and so that makes it really easy to search for. I have a actual wiki CamelCase tiddler out here that talks about some of the advantages and disadvantages and why I chose to do that out there. Let's talk about how we actually organize this. What is the topology of our ideas in here? How do they link together, and what TiddlyWiki functions do we use to do that? So links are the primary method. As we saw a minute ago, you can click on a link anywhere in here, and I use links to refer to every related idea that I might have in my Zettelkasten, and even some I don't. We were in one a moment ago, if I can get out there, right, where there's some of the links in italics. That means that the tiddler doesn't currently exist yet, but it's something that would potentially make sense to go out and write about in the future. And in this one, you see this winner-take-all one, right? You can see that there are actually 3 other tiddlers where I linked to the idea of a winner-take-all competition. And so I can, even though this doesn't actually exist and I haven't explained what it is explicitly, I can kind of get an implicit idea of what it is simply by looking at these other places where I've discussed that. And so, I can see how it's used in many different places, much like you might be able to see examples of how a word is used and know what it means even without looking up the dictionary definition. So TiddlyWiki makes it really easy to see ideas in the way that your other ideas interact. And that will be a principle for some other choices I made in designing this Zettelkasten later. When we talk about tiddler types, I'll come back to that. So links are the primary way of joining ideas together. They just express arbitrary relationships between things. Tags in TiddlyWiki are a somewhat more structured way of doing things. They express, I would say, membership. So you can see, for instance, that this particular tiddler is a member of the TiddlyWiki video series, which makes sense. Currently, this is only the second video on TiddlyWiki I've ever done, but if we had more, they would all show up in this list. So that's membership. I use them for many different kinds of roles, all of which are ways of expressing membership, but membership in different things. So if we look at our tags list, I actually have these color-coded by role to make them easier to identify what does what. So we can go through these. The green ones, these are actually the default color. If I ever change the colors of my wiki, it would change with them. But these are disciplines or topics, you might call them. So we have things like, you know, dreaming and ethics and psychology and learning and so on and so forth. These are kind of broad topics. These match up with, if you know much Zettelkasten, with Luhmann's indexes, which is kind of a way of providing jumping off points into the linky nature of the Zettelkasten. So if you know you want to look at stuff related to psychology, if you have a giant card file or a giant TiddlyWiki with a bunch of arbitrarily named tiddlers, it might not be obvious where you can start, and you've kind of got to find somewhere to start so that you can follow those links to whatever you're looking for. And, you know, in the modern system, we have a full text search, which sometimes helps you get closer, but not necessarily. Right now, I would say these are mostly complete tags, so there's actually a lot of things tagged, like probably pretty much everything that relates to psychology I have listed here. That's a lot of tiddlers. As I end up having more tiddlers in here, I do anticipate needing to strip that down. And so what I'll do is, much like Luhmann did, remove anything that's not super relevant. So you would keep only the things that are most closely related to psychology, or where you would most want to start a search for things on psychology. So you might pick index tiddlers, which we'll talk a little bit about in a minute, which kind of gather together ideas on a particular topic. You might keep ones that you're currently doing a lot of work on so you can more quickly get to them. And maybe just anything that you particularly like or find yourself referencing most often. And so then the other ones you would still be able to get to. You would just have to start with some of the ones that were tagged with that psychology tag and then follow some links through there. And it's generally fairly easy to do as long as you've created enough links between your tiddlers. I have these in the wrong order. I'll go back and reorder them just so that they show up in the same order they do over here. The black ones are used for that private-public switch that I've talked about earlier. We'll discuss that a bit later on. The blue ones are lists, so this TiddlyWiki video series is a demonstration of that. You can see there's also this list icon there. And so what these do are, there's a kind of a set of things like programming languages, and so every programming language I have defined in here is tagged programming language, so I can quickly see all of the things that are members in that. That's kind of the most obvious use of membership, I would say. There are also red and orange tags, which are types and pseudo-types. So types are used to identify whether something is an idea or whether it's kind of an auxiliary topic. So things with no tags are ideas, so those are kind of the primary purpose of the Zettelkasten. That's why I have one, is in order to have ideas. But when you're trying to classify ideas and make your way between ideas, oftentimes it's helpful to have various peripheral information there as well. So for instance, there are sources, which describes where the ideas might have come from, or are mentioned, whether you initially learned about them there or not. You have people. This is PAO, stands for person, animal, or organization, because it's kind of a slightly broader category than people. There are images that kind of go along with tiddlers. For instance, if there's a person that you want to include an image on, or a diagram or something like that. And I'll talk a little bit more about the different types later. The orange ones have kind of similar roles, but they tend to be a little bit more specific, and the wiki doesn't change behavior based on orange tags. The wiki will change behavior based on what red tag, if any, you've applied. So for instance, if I apply a place tag to a place, it's going to end up with a map of that place showing up on the tiddler, the way I've set up the wiki. And it will also influence where things show up in the reference explorer at the bottom of the page. You can see that a lot of these line up with the type names. I'll talk a little bit more about the Reference Explorer later. Lastly, there is the yellow tags, which are just used for identifying things where I would like to provide more attention or change things. So stub means I'd like to expand the article. Needs excision means that it's kind of a monster tiddler or card, and it contains several different ideas that I would like to break out into ideas that can be better referenced on their own. And there's needs attention, which means that there's some unspecified problem with it, or I just think that it could stand to be reworked or revisited. And so these I will just kind of naturally add and remove as I discover that things need work or I clean them up. So those are all of the tags. One type of tag is an index tiddler. So an index tiddler, as I briefly mentioned earlier, is rather than containing an idea of its own, it talks about the relationships between ideas purely. Obviously, individual ideas also are related to things, and they include links in them, but sometimes it's good to get a larger overview of that. So this index tiddler I've actually split into a number of different tabs. In TiddlyWiki, each of these is its own tiddler, and then I can specify which ones I want to list as tabs. But you can see this particular one is written in paragraph form. Others are in outline form or are automatically generated lists of some kind. But all of them have the basic commonality that they consist primarily of links to other ideas and potentially descriptions of them. So these are, I understand, a particularly important part of your Zettelkasten as it gets larger. I haven't found them all that necessary at this time, but they are definitely useful already, and I expect them to play a larger role in things as the tagging starts to reach its size limits, where it becomes implausible to scan through a tag looking for something that you're finding, and it becomes more important to be able to kind of expand that into a multi-level hierarchy, right? So, you know, if I click on learning here, and I've got all the learning stuff, I would like to be able to have one of the learning items just be this, and then, you know, all of the critical ideas in learning I can find within this tiddler, so that I can, instead of trying to pick something out from a giant list, I can kind of answer some questions about what broad type of idea related to learning it is and go from there. Another thing kind of related to index tiddlers is I often use it on index tiddlers, but not necessarily exclusively on index tiddlers. That is Stretchtext and Transclusion of descriptions. So I make pretty heavy use of the default field in TiddlyWiki called description, which is used for a lot of system tiddlers. This is an example of a place where that is used. I use the description field to provide basically a summary of the item. So this is a personality test that we did as a team building exercise at work. I threw up some of my results on here. So it specifies like your 5 greatest strengths is the basic idea of this assessment. And so I created one tiddler for each of them, and you know there's some general information on it, but there's also a single sentence summary that I've put here in this description field. And so what I do up here then is I use TiddlyWiki's functionality to be able to create a dynamic list. So it's going to pluck every tiddler that's mentioned down here in the list field and show its title and that summary of it. Now, if you know TiddlyWiki, you may be wondering, well, why didn't you tag them Strengths Finder report? That's kind of often the more natural way to produce a list of things that kind of come underneath Strengths Finder report. The basic reason is because I already have, like, probably over 100 tags. I haven't counted. If I did that every place I had a list of 5 items, I would quickly have so many tags in here that I wouldn't be able to use the tags anymore. So while I do use tags for lists of things, where that seems like the best application of the model, that's why I've got some blue ones over here, I do also use other methods to create those lists. One of them being this, just place them in the list field if there's only a couple of them, and pull back those results via that list field. Another way that I do something very similar is through Stretchtext. So here's another one. Rather than having that description, what I've done is I've used a stretch links macro. This is actually a plugin for TiddlyWiki that I've written called TiddlyStretch that does this. You can specify just a TiddlyWiki filter, And then what it's going to do is provide these kind of expandable things. So if I pick one that I want to see more about than the summary, I can click this plus button, and it's going to transclude that whole tiddler right here. This is actually customizable. I'm not going to be able to think of an example right now, but I do have some where instead of transcluding just the description and text fields, it actually transcludes the tiddler through a template, which can display basically anything arbitrary based on the contents of that tiddler. Templates in TiddlyWiki are extremely powerful if you don't know a lot about them, and so you can customize this stretch text basically to whatever degree you want. Actually, picking the collection is, as you can see in this case, done by choosing the members of this tag, all current tagging. But we could have done the same thing where I put it in the list field, say, if I had chosen to do it that way. Another method that I use for kind of lists of things, but not exactly, is subtiddlers. The main distinction between when I use a subtiddler and when I use a tag or that listing out method is that subtiddlers are used where the smaller tiddlers can't really stand on their own. So an example is a series that I'm working on card patterns for spaced repetition. So these are basically, if you don't know how to do a good job of asking a particular question on a spaced repetition flashcard, if you don't know anything about spaced repetition, you can learn more by Googling spaced repetition, or I have a series of popular articles on my blog, control@backspace.org. Just look for the memory series. But it's essentially a way of presenting flashcards at intervals carefully calculated to optimize your memory. So for each of these particular patterns, it's kind of an encyclopedic form, maybe. So there's a formula of how exactly you would write the card, what goes on the front and back of the flashcard, some examples of it, some advantages, disadvantages, cautions, usage notes, etc. And so there's actually barely anything within this tiddler's text. There's only this Anki pattern template here. And so what it actually does is there are a series of subtiddlers. These are defined as subtiddlers in my framework by a naming convention, which consists of the base tiddler name slash and then the subtiddler name. And so, for instance, the contributors here, which has a little bit of information about that, is actually just coming right out of this overlapping close pattern slash contributors. And that Anki pattern template is just looking through all of those subtiddlers and making them show up in this accordion under the in the correct order, in a standard order that's the same for all of the patterns. So subtiddlers are a way, if you need to or want to split things out into multiple tiddlers in order to more closely keep track of what the exact role of a piece of information is, but you don't really need to reference those subtiddlers separately. You can put them in subtiddlers. And I mentioned in this outline, right, it is a matter of how tightly they're coupled. If you know much about like software architecture or any related subjects there, we have things that are, many ideas that are loosely coupled where they are related to each other, but you could kind of take one out and replace it with something else, or even not have it at all, and it wouldn't really make a huge difference. Whereas with these tightly coupled ones, if I took out just the contributors section of that Anki card pattern and put that in its own tiddler and didn't have any of the other information, it wouldn't really be very useful by itself, because it would only have, a couple things to it, right? This is not useful by itself. It's only useful as part of the creative pattern. Bibliographies are another sort of kind of index. You can find several of these on the public one. Let's take a look at the Git one as an example. So the way I primarily use this is if somebody comes to me and is like, hey, Soren, you know a lot about Git. I'm learning Git. What should I read? I can send people a link to this bibliography. Also, if I'm just thinking about a great thing about Git that I've read and I don't remember what it's called or where it is, I can come out here and look at it. So this is actually super easy to create. It's just aggregated out of the individual source tiddlers. So I mentioned that I take notes on each source here, and I put something in as a source to my Zettelkasten if it's either a full book I've read or if it's an article that I think is particularly deep or I'll want to reference again in the future. or, if there are notes that I've decided go into my Zettelkasten as a result of reading that. And so to put it in the bibliography, all I have to do is fill in this custom bibliography field with the name of the bibliography, and it magically shows up on the bibliography. You'll notice there's also these kind of like annotated summaries for each source, and those again come out of this description field that I use frequently for summarizing things. I've actually thought about making that description field show up somewhere, near the top of the tiddler, like maybe underneath the title or something. I haven't done that at this point, but it's definitely something I am thinking about doing in the future. I might have to start doing that summary more often, but I think it would probably be a useful exercise in determining exactly what that tiddler is about. The Write tab. So the Write tab is a way that if I have 30 minutes and I want to spend some time working in my Zettelkasten, but I don't necessarily have any ideas jumping out at me, it's a place that I can figure out what I want to work on. So stubs are things that I've inserted and decided, hey, this is something I would like to talk about in the future, but I haven't actually really written anything to speak of about it. So oftentimes I'll just like copy and paste something in here. Like here I've pasted in a quotation here, and then I added like a little sentence kind of explaining what the idea is, right? But this isn't something that if I just sent this to you, you would be like, wow, that's a great idea. You'd be like, what the heck is that about? At least probably if you happen to have read a lot of stuff that's similar to me on this topic, it might make sense to you, but it probably won't. So a stub is kind of a lower level than a proper Zettelkasten note, because one of the principles of Zettelkasten is that you should write as if for somebody else, even if you don't have an audience. You want to really describe that idea well, because that prevents you from doing a series of rhetorical moves that we often use on ourselves. And I'm sure you recognize all of these where you say things like, yeah, I don't know exactly how to explain that, but I know what it means. Usually that means you don't actually know what it means because you can't describe it. But it's very easy to kind of do that kind of hand waving in your head. But once you try to write it out, that doesn't look convincing at all. And so you have to figure it out. You have to figure out what other things it relates to. So stubs are not intended to be completed content, but they are intended to provide a long list of interesting things that I could talk about in the future. The missing tab is just hopped over from the more tab. It's tiddlers that I've linked to, as we described a moment ago. I'm trying to remember what tiddler we were in. Well, here's actually one, right? So tiddly map, I have a link to it, but the tiddler hasn't been created yet. So this just pulls together a long list of all the things which are missing, which I've linked to, which I haven't created. I'm not going to actually go to the missing tab because since we are in the private Zettelkasten, there's actually a number of titles in there which are private, and I discovered that earlier. But you can go to the missing tab on the public one or look at it in your own TiddlyWiki if you're unsure what's in there. Needing attention, this is just those things that are tagged with that yellow needs attention tag. Needing attention is kind of I put that on there if it's obvious what needs to be done with it, but I don't feel like describing it in detail at the time that I apply that tag, so it's kind of a catch-all category. Needing excision, as I mentioned, says there's actually like a lot of different stuff in here. It's a mess. I'd like to clean it up. Like here's a good example, good shared flashcards. It's like, oh gosh, what is this? There's like a 3-level outline here and like a quote and then like a horizontal rule, and so there's probably like 3 or 4 different ideas in here that I need to kind of disentangle to clean up my thinking. To-do items, anywhere that I write the word to-do in square brackets, so link to the tiddler to-do, and then write something, gets automatically pulled into here. So if there's an arbitrary thing that I think I need to do to an article or think about or do research on or whatever, I can write that and it will gather it together into here. And open questions are kind of like to-dos, but there are things where I have a great question, but I don't know what the answer to it is. So, if I open one of these up, so here's an example, like how does one avoid this cognitive problem? Many of these there may not be an answer for, but they are things where I envision myself possibly having additional insightful ideas in the future as I continue to live my life and explore similar ideas. So I kind of create this list so that I can circle back around later and see if time has provided me with any other answers. whether something I could write directly in here or whether there are other ideas in the Zettelkasten that I could link it to that might help iteratively build that insight through future exploration. All right, let's talk about the reference explorer. So this is at the bottom of every tiddler. I have pointed you at it before, but not really talked about what the function is. So a lot of people have these in order to provide backlinks or something, kind of similar to this. A backlink, if you are not familiar with these kinds of information systems, is, in here I link to continuous improvement, but perhaps somebody else links here. So, if I'm on continuous improvement, the Zettelkasten demo, I'm going to have to go to all here, but the Zettelkasten demo video is a backlink of continuous improvement because Zettelkasten demo video linked to continuous improvement. So this means that instead of links being a kind of one-directional experience, the list of links and backlinks together provides you with a full accounting of what is related to what, even if you don't go and talk about both of them in the other idea. Some people only put backlinks in the section down here that lists the backlinks. I also list the forward links. You might say, well, that's not necessary because the links are up here already. But if I am trying to find something by repeatedly jumping through a bunch of links, I don't really want to come out and read a bunch of prose in order to figure out what links are in it, especially if the link is not the title of the tiddler. Like here, this one says never walks backwards, but the tiddler title, which you can see in the tooltip far in the lower left of the screen there, is the tiddler titled walk backwards. Sometimes, of course, since this link text is arbitrary, they can be even further apart. This always lists the tiddler title. So I find it is much faster to scan and navigate through things when I have both the links and the backlinks. In the case of this tiddler, since I just created it as an outline, there are no actual backlinks, so it is all forward links in this case. But most of the time you'll tend to find a mix of links and backlinks. For instance, if we hop into that continuous improvement one that I was showing, in this case it's mostly backlinks and only a couple of outbound links, because continuous improvement, I think, is a widely applicable idea, whereas there's not all that much to say about what continuous improvement is. It's kind of a combination of a couple other ideas. You'll notice that here it shows the tags and the date it was last modified in an attempt to give you a little bit of context about it. Also, if you don't know what something is and you want to just kind of expand it in place, you can click right there. The contrast is not really great on here, but I only do it very briefly to figure out what the thing is, so I don't care that much about it. I'm sure it's something that I could fix if I wanted to spend more time fixing it. I'm not necessarily sure that the tags and the modified are the best way to use this limited amount of space. I have also thought about doing description. Like I said, I'm kind of working on expanding what that description field can be used for and how often I use it, but that's what I have for now. Now, a lot of times, most of these open on the Ideas tab, so this specifically excludes many of these other things like indexes, people, places, and so on. If you do want to hop into one of these, one of the most common ones I come to is sources, right? So I might have a great idea. Let's find one that I was looking at recently here, if I can remember where it is. Dang, I can't remember what it was. Here, I think it was this one. Notes must link. So you can find all of the places where the idea of notes must link are referenced. So if I write a note and I got the idea from a particular source, I will make sure to write that in the ideas tiddler. But also you can see there's a backlink here, right? So here's just a place where part of my summary of what the source was pointing out that this one of the central ideas of the source is this notes must link. Again, you'll have to look at that tooltip in the lower left to see exactly what tiddler that points to. And so this link backlink thing ensures that the idea is always related to sources that talk about it. Also, people will often show, that one didn't, but people will often show the author of the work and anyone else who is closely related to that work. I would say that people and sources are probably the two of these that I use the most often. Meta sources are just a way of aggregating sources. So if a source is like an article in a newspaper or magazine, the meta source would be the newspaper or magazine that it's stored in. And sinks are like sources, except they are things that I've written. So this is a graph theory terminology where when you have a graph where different nodes are connected by different edges, and they're directed edges, so the flow of information goes in only one direction. If there is no inbound links to an item or inbound edges, that is called a source, and if there are no outbound edges, that's called a sink. And as you may have surmised from that description, graph theory is a great way to actually represent links in a Zettelkasten. So a node is essentially a tiddler in this model, whereas an edge is a link. So the edge is just the connections between different nodes. If you're unfamiliar with graphs, there's a lot of great examples. It is one of my favorite branches of mathematics and computer science. Some you might be familiar with. Maps, like Google Maps, is basically running some complicated graphs to figure out how to take you from place to place. Dependencies, if you're ever installing software and it has to go grab other software in order to make the first set of software work, it uses a algorithm based on this kind of directed graph in order to figure out what things it needs to download first. So many things are very conveniently represented as graphs, including this. So that's why you'll often find me using that terminology. As subtiddlers, we've already talked about here. Indexes, we've talked about what those are as well. Those will show up here. And all just lists all of the other tabs together. Now, link graph, I did point at this a little bit earlier, but let's just talk about kind of why I added this. Sometimes ideas only goes one level deep. It's the direct backlinks and the direct links. Whereas if I go into the link graph, I can see 3 levels out, total of 4 levels deep, including the current one. And if there's some of these branches that I'm not really interested in, you can trim them by clicking the little closing or the minus sign there. And so this kind of lets you, if you're trying to see just all of what might be kind of related to how to take smart notes, this will let you see a lot more things at once. And it's kind of a cool view to have there. This is a plugin called TiddGraph if you are interested in it. Let's close out of a few of these demos. And that was the link graph. So types, I believe I've basically talked about all the types and what they do, except for perhaps notes, which is just if I'm taking notes on a lecture or a phone call or something like that, and I think ideas will end up in the Zettelkasten. As a result, I will often take them directly into the Zettelkasten just because it's convenient to have them next to it. And then, in my ideas, I can link back to those notes in order to provide a source for it. There are a few other types which you can find out in the red tags, including bibliography and conversation and image and so on. Most of those are not super important to this model, but some of them are kind of handy to have around. But let's talk about why I have types and why I include a lot of the ideas in there, because that is something that is definitely different from traditional Zettelkasten. A traditional Zettelkasten does not include sources. I guess this idea doesn't have any sources, but let's hop out to one. Where was I just at? How about this one? But in my case, I like to keep the sources in the same wiki, unlike in the traditional method where you kind of have 2 components, a Zettelkasten and a bibliography manager or a reference manager of some kind. And that's because TiddlyWiki is so great at linking different things together. So I showed you that briefly with the source a little while ago, but let's hop out to another one. So let's hop out to Alice in Wonderland. I'm a big Lewis Carroll fan. So we can start from sources and we have ideas, right? But then, for instance, maybe we'll say, okay, who's the author of this? Okay, Lewis Carroll. All right, what else did Lewis Carroll write? Oh, Through the Looking Glass. And so it gives us more different ways that we can hop through our tiddlers by seeing what other ideas are in a source. From the Ideas tab, and then the authors and the sources and the geographical places, and then where have I written about this topic, right? So there's a paper that I wrote in college about Alice in Wonderland that's in here, right? So I find that even if there's not actually all that much information on the nodes, this is a pretty short article about Lewis Carroll. It's not going to win any Wikipedia awards, but I'm not trying to be Wikipedia. If I want to know more about Lewis Carroll, I can go to Google and type in Lewis Carroll. I even have many person articles that don't even contain any content. They're just tagged person, and that's it. But that produces that node where you can hop to people in any tiddler where that person was mentioned, whether as an author or a person who holds a particular idea or any other relationship that a person might have to an idea or to a source. And then you can find all of the other things that are related to them. And that's something that I don't think shows up in the traditional Zettelkasten unless you happen to think of those references at the time you create them. And because those are all filtered out in the Ideas tab, it's very unobtrusive. It takes very little time to actually create those once you get into the habit of, typing the names of authors and sources in a standard format. They pretty much just create themselves. If you want them to show up under the people or sources tabs, you do have to actually click in on them and create them. Otherwise, they will show up as a missing-tiddler. But if we're up here, right, and say orphan note were a person, all I have to do is click on it, say edit, type in PAO, and close it. And now this is a person. Obviously, I don't actually want this to be a person, so I'm going to delete it. But it takes about 3 seconds to do, and then you get all those great connections. So that is the functionality of types. Let's move on to a little more TiddlyWiki and technical stuff here. I will try to keep this kind of brief because I notice I'm already at 40 minutes, which was a little longer than I was hoping to be at here. But I do think it is valuable to see some of the custom TiddlyWiki stuff that I've done here. First, let's talk about some of the interesting plugins that I've installed here. One thing is CodeMirror. CodeMirror is a kind of nice text editor that you can include in your browser, and there's official plugins for TiddlyWiki. There's also an edition of this CM Plus for a better CodeMirror plugin. This is pretty new, but what that does is when you're out here and you type a header or bold, italic text, I guess it doesn't work if you nest it. Nothing ever works during a demo. But it will try to actually make the text look kind of like the wiki text markup. So even I'm very familiar with wiki text, and I still find this extremely helpful. Certainly you can always do the side-by-side preview, but it's even nicer to have it just in there. The other thing CodeMirror does is you can do, for instance, searches within your text editor. And you can even, I have VI key bindings here. If you don't know VI, it's a really weird old editor, but it has one of the best keyboard shortcut schemes of any program ever designed. It's extremely unintuitive, but it lets you do total magic with editing, and you get all the buttons on the keyboard to do complicated stuff. So if you are going to spend a lot of time editing text, it is worth adding a couple plugins and taking some time to get that editor to work like you want. Otherwise, you're stuck using the browser's cruddy little text entry thing to write hundreds of thousands of words, which is not a lot of fun. And in fact, it's something that turns people off using TiddlyWiki entirely on many occasions. Another plugin here is the details widget. So when I did show those patterns earlier, let's pull up another pattern here. These little accordion things, these are generated by the details widget. It's a super useful plugin just to be able to have those expand and contract things. Very simple. You'll find a ton of uses for it once you have it in your wiki. Relink. Traditional Zettelkasten has immutable identifiers, which means they can never change once you've created them. I don't have that. I can come in here and change the title to whatever the heck I want anytime. But relink is going to make it so that the links don't break when I do that. So let's take a look at Zettelkasten here. I'm sure I've referred to Zettelkasten many times in the Zettelkasten. And let's say I decide I want to make the name plural, right? In German, that's the plural form. And so it's going to identify all these things need to be updated. And if I use that check mark, it's going to go just change it. So it will change links, it will change custom fields, it will change macro parameters, it will change transclusions, probably change some weirder TiddlyWiki stuff that I'm not thinking of right now. So that's an absolute lifesaver if you have a large wiki. Going and updating all those manually would be prohibitive. And then if you determine that you've created a bad title, it's almost impossible to change. If you don't know that plugin, you should definitely check it out. It's pretty essential. Stretchtext. I showed Stretchtext a little bit earlier. There's a plugin for it. You can find it on my GitHub or just by searching TiddlyStretch. Lost track of where I am here, sorry. Tiddly tables, that's just a framework for creating tables that kind of gives you a nice graphical way to create complicated dynamic tables. I use it for the Reference Explorer. TiddGraph does this little link graph thing. And triple click to edit is a handy thing that I added. So in TiddlyWiki Classic, back in the dark ages, you could double click anywhere on a tiddler in order to start editing it, and that was the primary way that you would often do that. In TiddlyWiki 5, it was determined that a lot of people were getting really confused when they double clicked on something trying to highlight text and it suddenly dumped them into edit mode. It was especially a problem for people viewing TiddlyWikis on the web who didn't know TiddlyWiki, and suddenly like the page would explode into this mess of wiki text goo that they didn't know what to do with. So that was turned off by default, but I do find it quite convenient to be able to click anywhere in the tiddler in order to start editing it, because I switch from view to edit mode quite a lot. And so I found this plugin that restored that behavior in TiddlyWiki 5, and I modified it so that you have to actually triple click, so that makes it a little harder to accidentally double click on it. Again, I do have that out on my GitHub if that's something you're interested in, which by the way is github.com/sobjornstad. Oh, I skipped TiddlyRemember, which is another plugin that I've done. This lets you embed Anki notes in your TiddlyWiki. So the way this works is, we can actually look at this pattern, right? These use TiddlyRemember. So you can put a question and answer or a fill in the blank. And it's got this little unique ID number here. And if we were to go out to the flashcards program Anki, which I'll just toggle out there real fast, if you have TiddlyRemember installed in Anki as well, there's an option to sync from your TiddlyWiki, and you can configure TiddlyRemember so that you can actually point to your wiki and say, here's a filter, here's exactly what tiddlers I want to pull the questions from and turn them into flashcards directly in my spaced repetition flashcards reviewer. So all I have to do is drop in this question and answer using the button right on the toolbar, or Alt-R, and I write a question and an answer, and then as soon as I sync, that will show up in my spaced repetition flashcards reviewer, where as long as I'm studying every day, I will start magically remembering this contents. So that's pretty nifty, is if as you're taking notes, you run into things that you would really like to remember and not just have notes on, you can very quickly get those cards into your memory. Some miscellaneous custom stuff that's not plugins that I built. Let's talk about the public-private switch first, because that's something I get a lot of questions on from people. So in TiddlyWiki, it's not really possible to do security, at least not currently. One of the most common models of distributing a TiddlyWiki is to send a single HTML file that contains the contents. If you're doing that, there's not really anything that you can do to prevent people from accessing parts of the TiddlyWiki, because you just send them the entire contents of the wiki in an HTML file, and even if you implemented some kind of security measure, they could just open the HTML file in a text editor and go find your secret hidden text. It would be possible to encrypt it, I suppose, but now we're getting pretty complicated, and so I actually take a much simpler approach to protecting the private data. That is, in this private wiki that we're looking at right now, I have options to set metadata on all tiddlers on whether they should be private or public. And then every night I run a script which goes through and it actually builds a new wiki out of only the public stuff, and then it uploads that to the web where you can view it. So you probably have noticed by now, I was even pointing it to it earlier directly, this publish this tiddler checkbox. What this will do if I check or uncheck it is change whether there is a public black tag on here. I also will have this in edit mode, publish this tiddler, public shows up. You'll notice there's also a thing up here which indicates whether you are editing a private or public tiddler. You may notice that it didn't change when I did that. This is a bug that I haven't fixed yet. I know how to fix it, I just haven't done it. But if I go out and come back in, it will say correctly now that I'm editing a public tiddler. So that's kind of nice, just if I'm writing something and I'm wondering, hey, is this public or not on the web? I can quickly look up there and see. There is another public-private method that I occasionally use. It's called the PrivateChunk. So the use case for this is if I have something that's mostly public, and I've written a bunch of public stuff, and then I have some super secret stuff in the middle of it. Maybe it's just like one sentence or something that I would like to include, but that I don't want to share with everyone on the internet. it would be kind of a shame to have to make the entire thing private just because of that. So in TiddlyWiki, a quick way that we can get around that is by creating a separate tiddler for the stuff that we want to use in a different role, namely whether it should be private instead of public. So that's exactly what I do. I have a naming convention for this. It is a subtiddler of the public stuff tiddler, so it'll be public stuff, and its name will be P for private. And so I'll do this perform excision, and then I will make it transclude it through the PrivateChunk template. You'll see that immediately this thing came up saying this PrivateChunk is not tagged PrivateChunk. I'm just going to click that button to fix it. Now it's going to say, here is a little piece that's private, and it's going to transclude that tiddler. If I click on the link, I will get out to that individual tiddler where I would be able to edit it, super duper secret stuff, and then that would show up there. The way this is going to work is, let me set this metadata how it would be set. This one would be public, but this one would not be public. Just having that private chunk is enough to exclude it directly, so even if I clicked publish this tiddler, it wouldn't actually be public. And so when this does get published, this public stuff /p tiddler is going to be missing. What happens in TiddlyWiki if you transclude a tiddler that doesn't exist is just nothing shows up. So it would look like there were only these two lines in the tiddler. Now, if in the public site you do come in and edit it, you would see this public stuff /p transcluded through PrivateChunk. But because of my naming convention of /p, the title doesn't really divulge any information about its contents, so that's not really a big deal unless you're trying to hide the fact that you didn't want to publish some part of the tiddler for some reason. I don't normally have more than one of these, but if I did, they're P2, P3, P4, and so on. Let's go ahead and delete these test tiddlers here. So just one more step, maybe it would be interesting to look at how this is actually built. So if we hop out to terminal here and I go into the directory where I keep my TiddlyWiki, I have a script in here called publish, and there's a TiddlyWiki filter embedded in here which says exactly what should be included in this new wiki. So it's either anything that's a system tiddler or anything that's public. System tiddlers are always implicitly public because if you didn't do that, you would have to go through and individually tag like somewhere around 1,000 system tiddlers public just for it to work correctly. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to use the wiki at all because a lot of TiddlyWiki's core content is in system tiddlers. So I just make sure that I don't put anything that would be private in a system tiddler. Since I only use system tiddlers for storing like kind of plugin-like logic I create, I don't know why I would want to keep any of it private anyway, so that's not really a big concern. It also goes through and removes a couple plugins and stuff that we don't need in there. Then it just kind of does some initialization stuff here. It exports all tiddlers that match that filter into a new wiki using the save wiki folder. Then it does a thing called the private person replacement table. So this checks for the names of anybody who has that PAO tag and their person tiddler is not marked public. And if it finds them, it replaces them with that person's initials. So this is just a courtesy to people I mention who aren't public figures and who I'm only mentioning in passing. That way their name doesn't show up in Google search results for my Zettelkasten, where it's presumably not very relevant for them. Once that is done, it's going to externalize the images, so it's going to pop those out into a separate folder. That just makes the wiki load faster if you're a visitor to the website, because TiddlyWiki doesn't try to download those images to the browser until you've actually requested them by opening the tiddler in which they're used. And then lastly, it's going to compile it to a single HTML file out of its Node.js wiki folder format and actually push it to GitHub. And so once this has been completed, if we come out to my GitHub and the Zettelkasten SIB repository, you will see that there's this external images folder and the index file. And so once that's pushed, it is then available on that zettelkasten.sorenbjornstad.com through GitHub pages. If you are interested in this source code here, I expect to publish it at some point, but in the meantime, if you want it, feel free to email me, zettelkasten.sorenbjornstad, or zettelkasten@sorenbjornstad.com, or you can always just search for me on Google. I have a very visible contact page, so it shouldn't be hard to find. That is the private-public switch. A couple other interesting, less complicated things that I've done. I've added a couple buttons up here. So This is a copy tiddler title button. So if I click that, it's going to copy this Zettelkasten demo video to the clipboard. Obviously, it's not really that hard to double click on this, right click copy, but I do it so often in order to link to it from other tiddlers that I find it's nice to have a one-click button that will copy that. Similarly, this copies a permalink. So the permalink in TiddlyWiki is an anchor added to the end of the URL that will take you directly to the current tiddler. But I've modified this from the built-in permalink. So what this actually does is copy a link to it in the public Zettelkasten, even if I'm looking at it in the private Zettelkasten. So if I copy this, what we would get if this was the unmodified base TiddlyWiki permalink would be this l.562.nz1109 Zettelkasten #Zettelkasten demo video. But if I actually paste, what we're going to see is that it's zettelkasten.sorenbjornstad.com/that. And this is useful because most of the time when I copy a permalink, it's because I want to share the content with somebody, but it doesn't do them much good to have a link to port 1109 on my local computer rather than my actual publicly accessible website. So that just makes it much faster for me to share things. GIS data. So I think this is kind of slick. I spent a weekend messing with it at some point. So let's look at a state park in Minnesota. I've kind of got a project to document my experiences with a lot of these out here. So you can see that there's actually a map of where the state park is. And we could also get driving directions by coming in here. I'm not going to go in there because I forgot to change it before I started this video so that it doesn't show my home address directly on a webcast. But it would display directions directly to my home address or present a text box where I could type in the location where I currently am, and then it would show that. This just embeds the Google Maps API, and you can find that if you are out on the Explore tab on my public wiki. You can find how all that works in the SIB GIS folder. There's kind of 5 tiddlers that belong to that. And the way this works is there's just a latitude, longitude, and zoom level, and embeds that Google Maps API to that. So if you want to see how this would start, we can do like a place test here. When I tag place, that is going to make that template appear. But since there's actually no GIS information, it's asking us to input some. So if we hop out to Google Maps, and thinks I'm not really anywhere near where I am, but that's fine. So, you know, I can scroll around and find anywhere I want. Let's say I want to show somewhere in Chicago here. I don't know, how about the Art Institute of Chicago, right? So I can right-click on anything, and it will have an option to copy those GPS coordinates. Then I would just paste those in. Pick a zoom level. I usually like to start with somewhere around 12 to 14, depending on how detailed it is. And then as this map comes up, not sure why it took so long there, it will show you this area. And if you want to adjust the zoom, you can use this button, which will actually edit that zoom field for you. So it will permanently stay there, unlike this zoom, which will disappear as soon as you close the tiddler and reopen it. So, you know, I could rename this Chicago Art Institute if I wanted to. And I would have that link, the ability to get the driving directions and the map. Missing-tiddler helper. So this is something kind of handy that I added. If you are creating a missing-tiddler, so here's a tiddler that I know is missing, it's going to inform me that, hey, this is a missing tiddler. There are other tiddlers that link to it, specifically it's just. And so as soon as I save it, then those links are going to be no longer missing. This is really nice because it helps you get the context for why you linked to this in the first place, which is probably going to influence what content you decide to give it. It also is helpful to kind of get a head start on finding possible links that you might want to include in here because they're related to the topic. Source pasting. So thanks to Tones on the TiddlyWiki forums for showing me this, or the basic idea behind this. So if you paste anything in TiddlyWiki, it's going to give you the option to import it. And so what I've done is made it so that if I just paste a URL, it'll give me the option to import that as a tiddler called Untitled. When I open Untitled, there's going to be this TiddlyWiki template that shows up here called Import Options. And so I can actually fill out a form and make it into a source very quickly. So I can say this is an article published in 2021. I haven't read it yet. Import. And so now suddenly I have a source with all the metadata right in here. This is a much faster way to add a lot of stuff to my reading list than by manually creating new tiddlers that point there. and have that metadata. This is nice because I am working on a project to manage my reading inbox in here. This kind of shows you a little bit about how that works. This is still very much a work in progress, but the idea is that it's possible to postpone things that you're not interested in right now, and they will bounce back later. So this will show, I can pick if I'm currently reading it, or I haven't read it, or I'm partway through it. So this makes it, by integrating the list of what I'm reading and what I might choose to read next into where I take notes on the reading, just makes life easier because everything's all in one place. Once you get that source in here, you don't have to re-enter the information once you finish the book and want to take notes on it. It's just already there. Analytics. So I use Simple Analytics in here. If you're interested in web privacy, check out Simple Analytics. They're really cool. They are able to provide information about like who's accessing your website and what on it without actually tracking anybody. So they don't use any cookies. They don't collect IP addresses. They're basically completely unable to determine what users are accessing the site, and they don't keep a record of a user's different browsing habits across visits, but they're still able to give you that information. If you check them out, they will explain how exactly that works. But you can use this tag's raw markup in order to embed a snippet of script and a tracker into your TiddlyWiki, so that when people visit it on the public web, you'll get that analytics information. Tag coloration. So you may have noticed when I was showing the list of tags earlier that this is ordered by color, which is not a normal feature of the tags bar. Normally this would be a kind of mixed up rainbow rather than the neat rainbow, which doesn't follow the colors of the rainbow. It follows the hex order alphabetically in HTML. But it would be kind of all messy and intermixed, whereas this separates it neatly into categories. So the way I've done that is there's a core filters all tags shadow tiddler here. You can override this to provide any filter you want. So, let's say, just as an example, I wanted to include only tags that start with A, right? I could actually do that just by doing that, and suddenly only tags that start with A will show up in my tag list. Put this back to where it was. All I actually did was add this sort color step in my wiki. Similarly, when you're actually editing something, there are 5 columns here, and stuff is also sorted by color. And the way I did that is slightly more complicated, but in core macros tag picker, let's do a differences from shadow here. I have added a CSS class called 4columns. You might notice there were 5 columns. I've just never renamed that since I increased it from 4 columns to 5 columns. And I do have a CSS style sheet in here called 4column mode. I just copied this from somewhere. I don't remember where at this point on the internet, but that divides it up into those columns. That is all I'm going to show in terms of TiddlyWiki here. If you have questions on anything else that you've done in the Zettelkasten, feel free to email me or even post a comment on this video. I will be happy to share more about that. But I think that will target a lot of the stuff that I get asked about and that's most noticeable in here. Before I finish up, I just want to talk a little bit about the philosophy of a Zettelkasten project. So just some things that I've put on here about it that I've kind of decided on after working on the project for, I guess it's a little more than a year now. I've taken notes in similar ways to this in the past, so it's not like a year is all the experience I've had with keeping notes on my ideas at all. But that's about how much experience I have with the Zettelkasten in this environment. So one thing is just get started. I think Zettelkasten, for good reason, talks about making sure that you write out your ideas in full and explain them well and explain them as if you're explaining them to somebody else. But it's also possible for that to prevent you from ever writing ideas in at all. And so one of the ways I try to manage that difference is by having stubs, right? So I can include ideas that I don't really know what to do with yet and haven't written out. I also have just some notes on note cards that I haven't had time to put into my Zettelkasten yet. So it's okay to not have everything figured out the first time around. You don't have to, every time you add something, complete writing it exactly. And even if you do write it out in great detail, there might be things missing from that discussion. You might be wrong about stuff. That's fine. That's why we have continuous improvement, which is next. So no tiddler in your Zettelkasten is ever really going to be done. And there's always more information to learn. You might change your mind about something if you've expressed your opinion. You might learn that a fact was wrong. You're certainly going to learn about other ideas that are related to that idea that you might want to come back and link together. So it's important, make liberal use of this edit button when you're in here. If you're linking to a topic while creating a new tiddler and you determine that the thing you're linking to could use some work, go in and edit it. If you don't want to do it right away, if I don't want to do it right away, I'll add a to-do item or a needs attention tag to it. You might have your own mechanism if you're doing this. So that's helpful to avoid getting distracted sometimes, to be able to add it to that list, but still come back to it later. Another really handy heuristic I've found is Three-Links. So I've credited the blog post that this came from originally in here, but it suggests that you should have at least one of each 3 types of links in each of your tiddlers. Link to a more general idea, a link to a more specific idea, and a related topic. It's neither more general nor specific, just kind of on the same level. This is not always possible or practical in my experience, but it often is, more than you might think. It's a good way of making sure that it's really properly linked into the web of concepts in your wiki and your Zettelkasten. It's easy, if you're not thinking about this, to include only more specific ideas or only related topics. And if you do that, it might be possible in theory to find that tiddler by clicking a bunch of links, but there might be only a couple possible entry points. Whereas if you also include the more general and more specific ideas, you're much more likely to hit it, because you're increasing the number of contexts and types of contexts in which you can reach that idea. And having 3 links is also a kind of nice minimum for a tiddler. Sometimes you end up adding an idea that you've never talked about anything really related to at all. And so in that case, I try to add missing links, so you can probably at least identify more general ideas and more specific ideas or related topics that you have not talked about yet, but you know about. If it's something really new, you might not have that, and then, okay, I guess you just can't put in any links. That happens to me occasionally, but not very often. But thinking about this 3 links idea, I find is a very useful starting point. Zettelkasten never walks backwards. So this is a quote probably apocryphally attributed to Abraham Lincoln. So he says, "I might be a slow walker, but I never walk back." So this is one of the prime benefits of the Zettelkasten, is that once you get something in there, it's in a form that you can easily think about, and unlike your brain, it doesn't lose fidelity. So if you haven't thought about a topic for a year, but you have all the important ideas in that topic in your Zettelkasten, as soon as you go hit that cluster of notes, you'll probably be right back where you were when you were thinking about it before. Certainly the relevance of notes can decay depending on what the notes are about. If you're talking primarily about cutting-edge technologies in a couple years, they might not be super useful to you. They probably won't be wrong, but you might not particularly care to work with them. But a lot of the stuff that's in a Zettelkasten is longer-lasting ideas in most cases for most people. So that's not necessarily that much of a concern. And so the other lesson that I take from this is that it's not super important to be consistent with how you work in your Zettelkasten. If one day you write 50 notes and then the next week you don't write anything, that might not be the best way to motivate yourself. But if you have times where you have a lot of time to write in the Zettelkasten and times where you only put the very most important things in there, that's totally fine. You might be getting fewer ideas in there than you would otherwise, but presumably your Zettelkasten is not your primary deliverable that you're working on. You're probably trying to produce other writing or work, and your Zettelkasten is just a means to that end. So if the ends prevent you from working on the Zettelkasten as much as you might like, that's okay. Your Zettelkasten is not going to lose anything if you don't provide it attention for a while. Default to open. So this is a big thing for me. Most of my Zettelkasten, as I've mentioned before, is public on the web. That might be kind of unusual for notes. It's certainly not something that anybody did before the internet in general, but I think it has a number of advantages. One of them is that it encourages you to write well, because other people might come in and see your work. So that's kind of a very basic thing. Another one is that sometimes ideas prove to be useful in ways that you didn't anticipate. There are a lot of people in the world. There are certainly billions that have internet access, even if it's not all of the people in the world. And it may be possible that somebody you don't know is doing something kind of similar to you and might find your ideas useful. And when they do that, it's not just that they get benefit from your ideas, which is often great by itself. It's also that oftentimes if they find something really interesting or useful, they will take the time to email you and share some of what they're working on and share related ideas. And so basically for free, just by putting it out there, you can get advice and additional leads on your research. So, when you write in a more obviously publicly accessible format, such as a blog, you get more of those benefits, but you can also still get them through the Zettelkasten. And essentially, for me, it comes down to the cost of putting something online is very minimal compared to the benefits that you can get. And oftentimes those benefits can be unexpectedly large, whereas the costs rarely get unexpectedly large. It is still valuable to consider what you're writing. If you are writing something that is very politically charged and could get you in trouble, or is liable to be misunderstood, or is extremely personal, then you probably don't want to make that one public. That's fine. I do really like having this public-private switch. I don't know of anybody else who has that option to switch who does public Zettelkasten. There may be somebody that I just don't know about. But I think if you have a public Zettelkasten and you don't have that switch, you're often going to end up censoring yourself. And while that's not necessarily the end of the world, I do think you have a better Zettelkasten if you are able to have all of your thoughts in it linked together into one system. You can read more about the idea of default open, which is very entwined with the open source free software culture in general and everything related to that in that Tiddler on my public Zettelkasten. Fancy that. Polyspecialize. So this is a career planning methodology. I don't know if it's really a methodology. It's a career planning idea, which says that instead of trying to become like the world's greatest expert in one topic, you try to be pretty good at a number of different topics and really good at a couple of topics. So I think this is a useful philosophy for your Zettelkasten as well. There are probably a couple areas that you're going to be particularly interested in, maybe ones that have to do with your job or your research or even just your hobbies. But most people who have Zettelkasten, I think, probably are interested in a wide variety of things. They probably have a lot of ideas. I doubt that people who don't have a lot of ideas and aren't interested in ideas are likely to want to spend a great deal of time writing about them and relating them to each other. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's just me. If you are that kind of person, I think it is very valuable to include a wide variety of topics in your Zettelkasten. So you see that I have a lot of green tags, which I define as topics, covering a wide range of things. In fact, it's something that people often comment on when they run into my Zettelkasten. Had one person tell me I had an impressively well-rounded second brain at one point. I think this really does increase the value of your Zettelkasten. The connections between different disciplines are often the most valuable ones. And they're also often the hardest to find in the modern world because everything has become so hyper-specialized. And there are benefits to that. We've certainly gone deeper on fields than we have ever been able to do before because people spend their whole lives working on those little subfields. But it also means that it's possible to miss the forest for the trees and miss easy solutions that somebody has already come up with elsewhere just because it was in a slightly different context. So putting in many different topics and having the ability to interrelate all those different topics in one Zettelkasten is definitely a powerful weapon in terms of thinking and producing new creative ideas. Last but not least at all, you're not going to have time to record most of your ideas, and that's okay. Again, maybe there are some people who don't have more ideas than they can write out in great detail, but I doubt you're one of them. I'm certainly not one of them. Even if you don't think you have too many ideas now, once you start writing about your ideas in detail, I think you will probably find that you end up with even more ideas the more you write. And so even to that extent, I think there is a degree in which your ideas will inherently explode as you start writing about them. So prioritize. Instead of feeling like you can't read a book because there are so many good ideas in it, like pick the top 5 most important ideas. You can use a filtering process too. You can write down everything that looks interesting on a note card. This is what I often do. And then once you've finished the book, you can look at your note card, or 7 note cards. This may sometimes happen with particularly good books. And you can decide which of those ideas are the top 5 or top however many. You don't have to use a quota, but I think in many cases it's a nice way to force yourself to decide on the most important ones. And then you can write about those in your Zettelkasten. Don't worry so much about the rest. If they're really important, you'll probably come across them again at some point. I think that is everything for the Zettelkasten. Again, if you have questions about my process or anything, I would be happy to answer them. And if you have ideas for other stuff you would like me to show, including at some point we might talk about some TiddlyWiki implementation questions related to the Zettelkasten. There are a lot of different ways you could do it. Some people use pre-made TiddlyWiki editions such as Stroll that have some of the features such as backlinks and stuff built in already. But probably the most defining feature of TiddlyWiki, or characteristic of TiddlyWiki, is that you can make it do pretty much whatever you want. So figure out what Zettelkasten features and ideas you want to use, and then from there you can work to make TiddlyWiki work for you to do that. And you can continue evolving it. Like I mentioned, the description is a relatively new thing. I'm now using it in many different places. Certainly my tags and my links change all the time, and it is very easy to add additional tools to TiddlyWiki once you've learned it in order to improve your workflow slightly. So we will end it there. Thank you.